This is a useful decision tree when considering a repository. In some cases, funders have their own repositories or data commons where they expect you to deposit your data. Or if you're publishing with a certain journal, they may have their own requirements. If you don't have requirements, then is there a repository that's commonly used in your discipline? If you don't find a good fit, then consider your institutional repository. And finally, there are also general repositories that will take data from any discipline. Regardless of who you choose to go with, you should connect with the repository before listing them in any data management plan or other official documentation. You want to be sure that your data are suitable for that archive, that you budgeted for archiving and storage, as there can be associated costs, especially if your data are very large, and they can often give you a letter of support or language to use in data management plans to go with your grant application. Here's an example of a funder's list of recommended data repositories, in this case for NIH-funded research. And here's the list of repositories recommended by Nature for data associated with publications. I mentioned earlier that data sharing is particularly important for solving large, complex problems like addressing the current COVID-19 pandemic. I want to highlight several resources and initiatives that have emerged in recent months to facilitate data sharing for this urgent area of research in particular. These include the NIH Open Access Data and Computational Resources to Address COVID-19, and a recent NIH webinar which covers the activities of 7 generalist repositories to make COVID-19 research data more discoverable, including presentations by representatives from Vivly, Figshare, GitHub, Dryad, Zenodo, Harvard Dataverse, and Mendeley Data. The Research Data Alliance COVID-19 Working Group has produced a document with guidelines on data sharing. This is part of a larger effort by the Virus Outbreak Data Network, a collaboration by 4 global data organizations to implement technical components to make COVID-19 data more standardized and interoperable. And for data examining the social, behavioral, public health, and economic impact of the pandemic, ICPSR has created a new COVID-19 repository in their free open access repository. You're probably getting the sense by now that there are many different options when it comes to choosing a repository for your data. Many of these repositories do accept code and software as well as data, but I wanted to highlight one strategy for sharing research code, particularly if you're already working in GitHub. While GitHub is a popular place to share code and software, it doesn't offer some of the features that we like to see in a preservation quality archive. However, through a partnership with the generalist repository Zenodo, you can archive a time-stamped version of your GitHub repositories and get a DOI that can be used to cite that version. At this point, let's pause for another exercise. Using re3data.org or just using Google, find a repository where you might be interested in depositing your data. Take a look at the repository's website and try to assess it for these characteristics. First, decide if the repository seems reputable. Is there any information about certifications on their website? Do you know that it has a reputation within your field? Is it on any approved repository lists from stakeholders like funders or publishers? Second, will it take the kind of data that you want to deposit? Is it in the right discipline? Does it accept the right file formats or size of data? Next, assess whether it will be safe in legal terms. This often has to do with the communication of expectations for both data depositors and end users through terms of use. Does the repository have terms of use or deposit agreements that asks you to certify that you're sharing the data ethically, so not breaking any confidentiality or copyright laws? Can you assign a standard license or custom terms of use? Will the repository sustain the data value? This can take many different forms, but many of these things focus on making the data fair through the use of metadata standards, the generation of persistent identifiers and automated data citations, normalizing file formats, preservation activities, and other curation and quality review services. And lastly, will the repository support analysis and track data usage? It can be helpful to know how many people are viewing, downloading, or citing your data after it's been made available. Look at the submission guidelines, policies, procedures, etc. to find this information on the repository's websites. Again, feel free to take a moment to pause and do this exercise before moving on. Okay, finally, let's discuss findability. The only factor that we haven't discussed is discovery metadata. Discovery metadata is intrinsic to the repository system that you're using. As such, each repository has a defined standard that it uses to populate the metadata and make your data findable. We use the Dublin Core Discovery Metadata Standard in the CSU Digital Repository because it can be applied to anything. There are 15 core elements or fields to fill out describing your data. These elements have qualifiers that make the terms more specific. For example, there's a Dublin Core term for contributor that has a qualifier called author, which is a specific type of contributor. When you fill out the data submission form, you'll be entering some of this metadata yourself. There are additional fields that I fill out when I complete the data submission process. Let's look at an example dataset that's already in the repository. This is an example of data that were submitted as supplemental information for a manuscript. The abstract for the paper appears as the item description here. There's a list of authors, a publication date, the associated publication, and links to where the data live within the repository, in this case the data collection as well as collections for the departments that the authors are associated with. The persistent identifiers are the handle and the DOI on the left beneath the thumbnail. If you go to the full item record, you can see the complete Dublin Core metadata. Here we see the DC contributor author field that I mentioned earlier. We also have temporal coverage, some information about when the dataset was published in the repository, another description containing more information about the data, as well as funding. If you want to take a look at the data, you can click on this download view link and you can download it to your computer. So if you unzip the file, you can take a look and see that it contains a data set in CSV format, which we recommend. If you open the CSV file, you'll see that it's in tidy data format, with each row a different observation and each column a variable. The dataset also contains a README file, which contains a lot of contextual information about the dataset, including definitions and information about the variables. In sum, there are many benefits to sharing your data when this is possible. Use the FAIR principles when you're doing this, and choose a trusted data repository that's appropriate to your discipline. Thanks for listening. Make sure to contact me at mara.sedlins@colostate.edu with any data sharing questions, or see our data management services site to see what we offer.